The air in Trier was cool and damp on the morning of May 5, 1818. In a modest house along Brau Kikkergasse, near the ancient Roman gate that had stood for centuries, a child was born into a world that was still finding its shape after the great upheavals of revolution and war. The baby boy, Karl Heinrich Marx, entered life in a town where old stones remembered empires, where the ruins of Roman baths still whispered of power that had once seemed eternal, and where the present moment felt suspended between what had been and what might yet come. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a man of the Enlightenment, a lawyer who had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism, not out of sudden spiritual awakening, but from the practical necessity of a man who wished to practice his profession in a society that placed barriers before those who refused to conform. Heinrich carried within him the rationalism of Voltaire, the clarity of French philosophy, the belief that reason could illuminate the world. He was gentle, scholarly, a man who loved ideas and hoped his children might live in a world more tolerant than the one he had inherited. In his quiet study, surrounded by books, he would speak to young Karl about justice, about thought, about the power of the human mind to understand itself and its circumstances. Karl's mother, Henrietta, came from a family of rabbis and merchants. She was practical where Heinrich was philosophical, concerned with the tangible realities of household and family. She spoke often in Yiddish, maintaining threads of connection to a heritage that Heinrich had formerly set aside. In her presence, Karl learned that ideas did not float freely in pure air, but were rooted in the textures of daily life, in the food on the table, in the coins counted carefully, in the fabric of social bonds that held communities together or tore them apart. The Trier of Karl's childhood was a place of contradictions. It lay in the Rhineland, that border region that had passed between French and Prussian control, absorbing influences from both. French revolutionary ideas had swept through during the Napoleonic years, bringing with them notions of liberty, equality, and citizenship that had excited some and terrified others. Now, in the years of restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat, the old monarchical order was attempting to reassert itself, but the ideas that had been planted could not be entirely uprooted. The town itself bore the marks of different eras. Roman antiquity beside medieval churches, beside the newer buildings of the present age, each layer a testament to change, to the rising and falling of systems that had once seemed permanent. As a boy, Karl walked these streets with an intensity that marked him even then. He was brilliant, even his earliest teachers could see that, but his brilliance had an edge to it, a sharpness that could cut. He absorbed knowledge rapidly, voraciously, but he did not simply accept what he was taught. There was in him, even young, a tendency to question, to probe, to find the contradictions beneath smooth surfaces. In the classroom, he excelled at languages, at literature, at the classical studies that formed the core of education for boys of his class. He read Greek and Latin, walked imaginatively with Prometheus who stole fire from the gods, with Oedipus who sought truth regardless of cost. His relationship with his father was tender but complex. Heinrich saw in Karl a mind that could achieve great things. But he worried about his son's temperament, about the fierce pride he sensed growing in the boy. In letters that Heinrich would later write to Karl, when the young man was away at university, there runs a thread of concern, a father's gentle warning about the dangers of arrogance, about the need to temper brilliance with humility, ambition with compassion. Heinrich wanted his son to succeed, but he also wanted him to be happy, to find a place in the world that would value him. He could not have known. In those quiet evenings, when they discussed philosophy and law, that his son would spend much of his life as an exile, rejected by the very society Heinrich hoped he would join. Karl's education continued in the classical tradition. He attended the gymnasium in Trier, where he wrote essays that already showed the force of his thinking. In one early composition, he wrote about the choice of a vocation, arguing that the greatest happiness came not from self-interest, but from working toward the welfare of humanity. It was an idealistic vision, expressed in the somewhat grandiose style of a young man who had read much and felt deeply, but had not yet tested his ideas against the harsh textures of the world. Still, the seed was there, the notion that individual life gained meaning through its connection to something larger. That fulfillment came not from personal advancement alone, but from contribution to collective human progress. The streets of Trier in those years were not uniformly peaceful. Beneath the surface of restored order, tensions ran deep. The majority of people lived in poverty, working the vineyards that covered the hills around the town, or laboring in small workshops, their lives dictated by seasons and harvests and the demands of those who owned the land and controlled the commerce. Karl's family lived comfortably, insulated by education and professional status from the harshest struggles, but the poverty was visible, unavoidable. A boy who walked through the town could not help but see the beggars, the thin children, the exhausted faces of those for whom life was a constant grinding necessity. These images, perhaps, settled somewhere in his mind, waiting for a framework that would make sense of them, that would explain why the world arranged itself as it did. At 17, Karl left Trier for the University of Bonn, carrying with him his father's hopes and his own ambitions. The university town, with its ancient traditions and its population of young men suddenly free from family supervision, was a place of intellectual ferment and youthful excess. Karl joined a poets' club, he drank, he may have fought a duel, he accumulated debts. He wrote poetry, passionate verses dedicated to Jenny von Westphalen, the young woman from Trier who had captured his heart, the daughter of a Prussian aristocrat who had befriended the Marx family and treated young Karl with an affection and intellectual respect that had drawn the boy to him. Jenny was beautiful, cultured, educated, sought after by more socially suitable young men, yet Karl had somehow won her affection, though their engagement remained secret. In his poems, he poured out feeling in the romantic style of the age, verses that strained toward the sublime, but that carried also a darker undercurrent, a preoccupation with struggle and transformation. His father, receiving reports of Karl's behavior and his debts, was alarmed. Heinrich wrote letters of reproach mixed with understanding, urging his son toward more seriousness, toward attention to his studies rather than dissipation. After a year, Karl was transferred to the University of Berlin, a more serious institution where it was hoped he would settle into proper scholarly work. He arrived in Berlin in the autumn of 1836, and the city would mark him in ways that neither he nor his father could have anticipated. Berlin was the capital of Prussia, a center of state power, but also of intellectual activity. The University of Berlin had been founded with the vision of becoming a place where pure research and philosophical inquiry could flourish. The great philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel had taught there until his death, just a few years before Karl's arrival, and his influence still saturated the institution. Hegel's philosophy, dense, systematic, and revolutionary in its own way, dominated the intellectual atmosphere. It was a philosophy of history, of development, of dialectical progression through contradiction toward higher forms of understanding and organization. Reality, in Hegel's view, was not static but dynamic, constantly evolving through a process in which each stage contained within itself the seeds of its own transcendence. Karl initially resisted Hegel's philosophy. He found it abstract, difficult, too willing to justify the existing order by locating it within some grand metaphysical scheme. But the philosophy was everywhere, in the lectures, in the discussions that ran late into the night in student rooms, in the assumptions that underlay debates about religion, politics, art, and law. Slowly, almost against his will, Karl was drawn in. He joined a group known as the Young Hegelians, a circle of young intellectuals who accepted Hegel's dialectical method but turned it in a more critical, more radical direction. If reality developed through contradiction, they asked, what were the contradictions of the present age? If history moved forward through negation and transcendence, what in the current order needed to be negated? These were years of intense study and internal transformation for Karl. He read constantly, obsessively, filling notebooks with notes and reflections. He studied law as his formal subject, but his real education was in philosophy. In history, in the attempt to understand the forces that shaped human society. His health suffered from the intensity of his work, from long nights of reading and writing, from poor diet and the smoke-filled rooms where discussions raged. His father, watching from a distance through letters, continued to worry, sensing that his son was moving in directions that might lead away from the stable professional life Heinrich had hoped for him. In 1838, Heinrich Marx died, leaving Karl with a grief that was complicated by unresolved tensions, by the knowledge that his father had worried about him, had not entirely approved of the path he was taking. Karl was not present when his father died, an absence that may have haunted him. The loss of Heinrich meant not only the loss of a father, but the loss of a gentle, moderating influence, a voice that urged caution and practical wisdom. Karl was now more fully free to follow his own inclinations. But he was also more alone, carrying forward without that steady presence that had offered both support and restraint. He continued his studies, working toward a doctoral dissertation in philosophy. His subject was ancient Greek philosophy, specifically the difference between the atomism of Democritus and that of Epicurus. It might have seemed an obscure academic topic, but for Karl it was a way of exploring larger questions about necessity and freedom, about whether human beings were simply atoms buffeted by forces beyond their control, or whether there was space for will, for choice, for the assertion of human agency. He sided with Epicurus, whose atoms swerved unpredictably, breaking the chains of pure determinism. It was a philosophical stance that suggested something about Karl's own emerging worldview, about the possibility of humans shaping their own destiny rather than simply submitting to fate. The dissertation was completed in 1841, and Karl received his doctorate from the University of Jena, which granted degrees in absentia. He was now Dr. Marx, a trained philosopher, and he hoped for an academic career, for a position at a university where he could teach and write. But the political climate in Prussia was becoming more repressive. The new king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, was a reactionary who viewed the universities with suspicion, seeing in them hotbeds of dangerous ideas. Young scholars with radical inclinations found doors closing before them. A friend of Karl's, a young Hegelian named Bruno Bauer, lost his teaching position because of his critical writings on religion. Karl's own prospects dimmed. The academic path, which might have provided security and a platform for his ideas, was blocked. At 23, Karl Marx stood at a threshold, his future uncertain. He was intellectually formed but professionally adrift. Engaged to be married, but without the means to support a family. Filled with ideas, but without a clear channel for expressing them. The world he had been trained to join did not want him, or at least would not accept him on his own terms. He would need to find another way, another path. He turned toward journalism, toward the world of newspapers and public debate, where ideas could reach beyond the lecture hall and enter the arena of immediate political struggle. In Cologne, a group of liberal businessmen were founding a new newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, intended to push for political reforms, for constitutional government, for the kinds of changes that would benefit the rising commercial class. They needed writers, and Karl Marx, with his sharp intellect and his gift for polemic, was invited to contribute. He began writing articles, at first on issues of press freedom and censorship, then on social questions that were arising with increasing urgency. The work of journalism suited something in Karl's temperament. It was immediate, engaged with the present moment rather than lost in philosophical abstraction. His articles had a force to them, a directness that came from his ability to strip away mystification and expose the interests that lay beneath political positions. When the Prussian government imposed restrictions on press freedom, Karl wrote with barely contained fury about the hypocrisy of a state that claimed to serve justice while silencing criticism. When debates arose about laws concerning the theft of wood from forests, Karl examined the question with unexpected depth, showing how laws that appeared neutral actually served the interests of property owners against the desperate poor who gathered fallen branches for fuel. It was perhaps the first time he looked closely at how law and state power functioned in relation to economic need. How abstract principles of property translated into concrete suffering for those with nothing. His articles attracted attention. He wrote with such clarity and force that the newspaper's circulation grew. In October 1842, when Karl was just 24, he was made the editor. He moved to Cologne, that vibrant Rhineland city where commerce and industry were beginning to flourish, where the contradictions of the emerging modern world were more visible than in sleepy Trier or academic Berlin. As editor, he worked with intense energy, shaping the newspaper into an instrument of critical commentary, pushing boundaries, testing how far he could go in challenging the established order. The Prussian censors watched nervously, increasingly alarmed by the tone and content of the Rhinish Zeitung. In Cologne, Karl encountered for the first time the actual workings of modern economic life. He saw the factories beginning to rise, the workers streaming through the streets at dawn and dusk, the visible concentration of wealth alongside the visible depth of poverty. He attended meetings of businessmen and artisans, heard discussions of tariffs and trade, of wages and working conditions. He realized that the philosophical categories he had absorbed in Berlin were not quite adequate to explain what he was seeing. Political power, he began to understand, was not simply a matter of ideas or of state institutions in the abstract, but was intimately connected to material interests, to who owned what, to how goods were produced and wealth distributed. He also confronted practical questions about strategy and tactics in political struggle. How radical should the newspaper be? How directly should it challenge the government? Some contributors wanted to push further, faster, toward open calls for revolutionary change. Karl, as editor, had to balance principle against practicality, recognizing that if they went too far, the newspaper would simply be shut down and the platform would be lost. It was a tension he would navigate with varying success throughout his life. The tension between the desire for uncompromising truth and the necessity of strategic engagement with the possible. The engagement with Jenny von Westphalen had lasted years, kept secret at first, and then reluctantly acknowledged by her family, who could not have been pleased that this daughter of Prussian aristocracy was binding herself to a Jewish convert with uncertain prospects and increasingly radical views. But Jenny was not a conventional woman. She was intelligent, well-read, capable of understanding and engaging with the ideas that consumed Karl. In her, he found not just a romantic partner, but an intellectual companion, someone who could share the life of the mind that was so central to his existence. They were finally married in June 1843, when Karl was 25 and Jenny was 29, already considered rather old for a bride in that era. The ceremony was quiet, and soon after they left Prussia, The Rheinische Zeitung had been closed by government order in March 1843, suppressed because its criticisms had become too pointed, too dangerous to tolerate. Karl was now without a position, newly married, facing the question of what to do next. The answer came in the form of an offer from Arnold Ruge, another young Hegelian, to co-edit a new journal that would be published in Paris, beyond the reach of Prussian censorship. Paris, the city of revolution, the capital of radical ideas, the place where German intellectuals in exile gathered to discuss the transformation of the world. Karl and Jenny moved there in October 1843, beginning what would become decades of exile, of living in foreign cities, of never truly belonging anywhere. Paris in the 1840s was intoxicating for someone with Karl's interests and inclinations. It was a city of contrasts, of elegant boulevards and filthy slums, of revolutionary tradition and conservative reaction, of workers' conspiracies and philosophical salons. Karl plunged into the intellectual life of the German exile community, meeting with radicals and reformers, arguing about the path forward for Germany and for humanity. He read voraciously, trying to educate himself in economics, recognizing that this was the gap in his knowledge, the terrain he needed to master if he was to truly understand modern society. He began studying the British political economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, trying to grasp the laws they claimed governed the production and distribution of wealth. It was in Paris that Karl met Friedrich Engels, the beginning of a friendship and collaboration that would last until Karl's death. Engels was 2 years younger, the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer. But he had developed radical sympathies and had written perceptively about the condition of the working class in England, where he had been sent to work in his father's factory in Manchester. The two men recognized in each other kindred spirits, minds that worked in similar ways, a shared conviction that the world, as it was organized, was fundamentally unjust, and that understanding its workings was the necessary prelude to changing it. They talked for hours, nights, refining ideas, challenging each other, beginning to develop a framework that went beyond the abstract humanism of the young Hegelians toward something more concrete, more grounded in material reality. Karl was also, during these Paris years, beginning to encounter the actual workers' movement, not as an abstraction, but as a living reality. He attended meetings of workers' societies, groups of German artisans and French laborers who gathered to discuss their conditions and to imagine alternatives. He was impressed by what he found, by the intelligence and dignity of these men who worked with their hands, by their capacity for solidarity and their hunger for knowledge. They read, they debated, they organized. They were not the passive masses that middle class reformers often imagined, but active agents trying to shape their own destiny. This encounter shifted something in Karl's thinking. The subject of history, the force that would transform society, was not philosophers or enlightened statesmen, but the working class itself, those who created wealth with their labor, but who had the least share in it. His writing in this period became more focused, more materialist. In a series of manuscripts that would not be published in his lifetime, he began working out a critique of Hegel, arguing that Hegel's philosophy, for all its brilliance, had remained trapped in abstractions, in the realm of ideas, divorced from the material conditions of actual human life. Real human beings were not primarily thinking beings who then acted in the world. They were embodied creatures who labored to meet their needs, who produced and reproduced their existence through practical activity. Consciousness did not determine life. Life determined consciousness. It was a reversal, a turning of philosophy on its head, or perhaps, as Karl saw it, setting it right side up for the first time. He wrote about alienation, about how in the modern economic system, workers were estranged from the products of their labor, from the act of production itself, from their own human essence, and from each other. A worker in a factory did not create something whole and meaningful, but performed repetitive tasks at the direction of others, producing commodities that belonged to someone else, that would be sold for someone else's profit. The worker became, in effect, a commodity himself, selling his capacity to labor on the market, subject to the same impersonal laws of supply and demand that governed the price of grain or cloth. This was not the natural condition of humanity, but the specific result of a particular way of organizing economic life, and it could therefore be changed. Jenny was pregnant with their first child. They lived modestly, their income uncertain, dependent on contributions from Engels and on payments for articles when Karl could place them. The child, a daughter they named Jenny after her mother, was born in May 1844. Karl experienced the strange, doubled reality of many intellectuals. Living in the world of ideas and revolutionary possibility, while also navigating the mundane necessities of providing for a family, of paying rent, of managing the small but pressing anxieties of daily survival. The journal he was editing with Rouge, the Deutsche Franze sich Jahrbucher, published only one issue. The collaboration between Karl and Rouge, never easy, broke down over political and personal differences. Rouge was more moderate, more willing to work within existing frameworks, while Karl was moving toward more radical conclusions. But that single issue contained important work, including Karl's essays on the Jewish question and on Hegel's philosophy of right, pieces that showed his thinking developing, becoming sharper, more distinctive. He was working toward a synthesis, bringing together German philosophy, French political thought, and British economics into a new framework for understanding and changing the world. The Prussian government, alarmed by the radicalism of Germans in Paris, pressured the French authorities to take action. In January 1845, Karl was expelled from France, given a matter of days to leave the country. He had been in Paris only 16 months, but they had been formative months. Now he had to move again, this time to Brussels, another city of exile, another temporary refuge. Jenny packed their few belongings, gathered their infant daughter, and followed. This would be the pattern of their lives, the constant moving, the precarity, the dependence on the hospitality of foreign governments that could revoke permission to to stay at any moment. Brussels was smaller than Paris, less exciting, but it had a relatively liberal government that tolerated political exiles, as long as they did not involve themselves directly in Belgian politics. Karl and Jenny settled in as much as they could ever settle anywhere. Engels joined them for extended periods, and the two men continued their collaboration, their discussions, their joint work of hammering out a new understanding of history and society. They were young still, in their 20s, but they worked with the conviction that they were discovering truths of immense significance, that they were developing tools that could be used to transform human existence. Karl was becoming known within radical circles, his reputation growing as a sharp thinker and a forceful writer. He joined the Communist League, a small international organization of workers and intellectuals committed to the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a communist society. The League asked Karl and Engels to draft a statement of principles, a manifesto that would explain their position and their goals. Through the winter of 1847 and into early 1848, Karl worked on this document, refining it, shaping it, pouring into it the insights that had been accumulating through years of study and reflection. The resulting text, published in February 1848, was the Communist Manifesto. It opened with a declaration that would echo through the decades to come. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. In vivid prose, it outlined a vision of history as the history of class struggles, of societies organized around the conflict between those who owned the means of production and those who had only their labor to sell. It described the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie, how capitalism had transformed the world, creating unprecedented productive capacity, but also unprecedented inequality and suffering. It predicted that capitalism would produce its own gravediggers, that the working class, growing in numbers and organization, would eventually overthrow the system and establish a society based on common ownership and democratic control of production. Workers of all countries unite, the manifesto concluded. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win. The manifesto appeared at an extraordinary moment. Even as it was being published, revolutions were breaking out across Europe. In France, in the German states, in Austria, in Italy, people were rising up against monarchical governments, demanding constitutions, political rights, social reforms. It seemed, for a brief moment, as if the old order was crumbling, as if the world Karl and Engels had analyzed and critiqued was about to be transformed. Karl returned to Cologne, where he helped establish a new newspaper, the New Rheinische Zeitung, to support the revolutionary movement. For a year, he threw himself into the work of revolutionary journalism, using the newspaper to advocate for radical democratic reforms, for the arming of the people, for the continuation and deepening of the revolution. But the revolutions failed. One by one, the uprisings were suppressed. The old governments reasserted their power the moment of possibility closed. By the summer of 1849, Karl was once again facing expulsion, this time from Prussia permanently. He was stateless now a man without a country. France would not accept him. Belgium had already expelled him. He went to London, to England, imagining it might be a brief stay, a temporary refuge, until the next revolutionary wave. He would remain there for the rest of his life, more than 3 decades, living in a city that was the center of global capitalism, the heart of the British Empire. Writing in the reading room of the British Museum, trying to understand the system that dominated the world so that others might learn how to overthrow it. The early years in London were bitter. Karl, Jenny, and their growing family lived in poverty, crammed into 2 small rooms in Soho, one of the poorest districts of the city. Jenny, who had been raised in comfort, now struggled to feed and clothe their children on almost nothing. She pawned her belongings, went into debt to shopkeepers, endured the humiliation of poverty in a society that treated poverty as a moral failing. 3 of their children died in these years, small graves in foreign soil, losses that left scars of grief that never fully healed. The surviving children were often sick, hungry, dressed in threadbare clothes. Jenny held the family together through force of will and love, managing the impossible, keeping up appearances as much as possible, protecting Karl's capacity to work even as she bore the daily weight of material need. Karl worked in the British Museum, reading through enormous quantities of economic texts, trying to master the details of how capitalism actually functioned. He took notes, thousands of pages of notes, extracting data, tracing arguments, looking for the patterns and laws that governed the system. He read the reports of factory inspectors, documenting the conditions in which people labored, the hours, the dangers, the toll on human bodies and spirits. He read the debates in Parliament, the writings of economists and businessmen, trying to understand capitalism not from outside but from within, using its own concepts and categories to reveal its contradictions. His income was precarious. Dependent mostly on articles he wrote for American newspapers, particularly the New York Tribune, which published his analyses of European politics. Ingalls, working in his father's factory in Manchester, sent money regularly, supporting Karl and his family, making the work possible. It was an extraordinary act of friendship and solidarity, sustained over decades. Ingalls recognized Karl's genius, believed in the importance of the work he was doing, and was willing to subordinate his own theoretical work to provide the material support that allowed Karl to continue. The letters between them, hundreds of them over the years, show a deep bond, a meeting of minds, but also the strain of Karl's constant need, his requests for money that Ingalls provided, even when his own resources were stretched. Karl was difficult to live with. Those who knew him acknowledged this. He could be warm, generous, devoted to his family and friends, but he could also be imperious, dismissive, intolerant of disagreement. His intellectual certainty sometimes hardened into arrogance. He engaged in fierce polemics with other socialists who disagreed with his analysis, writing with a sarcasm and personal vitriol that sometimes obscured the substantive differences at stake. He was capable of tenderness, playing with his children, telling them stories, but he was also often absent, lost in his work, unavailable to the daily needs of family life that fell overwhelmingly on Jenny. The poverty wore on everyone. The constant anxiety about money, about rent, about whether there would be food tomorrow. But Karl seemed to see it as a temporary condition, something to be endured while he completed the work that would, he believed, contribute to the transformation of society. His health began to suffer more seriously. He developed liver problems, painful boils that erupted on his skin, making it difficult to sit and write. He suffered from headaches, from insomnia, from the general debility that came from poor diet, overwork, and stress. He tried various remedies, traveled to spa towns when he could afford it, seeking cures that were only temporarily effective. The illness became chronic, a condition he had to work around, managing pain and fatigue, while trying to maintain his intellectual productivity. Through the 1850s, as the revolutionary energy of 1848 faded and Europe entered a period of political reaction and economic growth, Karl continued his research. He was working toward a comprehensive critique of political economy, a systematic analysis of capitalism that would show how it worked, why it produced the effects it did, and why it was ultimately unsustainable, destined to be replaced by a higher form of social organization. The work grew and grew, the research expanding to encompass more and more material. He wanted to understand everything, to trace every connection, to build a complete picture. The perfectionism that drove him also paralyzed him, making it difficult to finish, to declare any particular text complete. Ingalls pressed him to publish something, to make his analysis available to the movement, to the workers who needed theoretical tools for their struggles. Finally, in 1859, Karl published a contribution to the critique of political economy, a relatively short book that presented some of his key ideas about the relationship between the economic base of society and its political and cultural superstructure, about how material conditions shaped consciousness and institutional forms. The book was dense, difficult, read by specialists more than by the general public, but it marked a step forward, a public statement of the framework he had been developing. He continued working on the larger project, which he was calling Capital. The first volume finally appeared in 1867, when Karl was 49 years old. It was a massive work, over 800 pages, weaving together economic theory, historical analysis, and empirical detail into a comprehensive account of how capitalism functioned. The central insight was the theory of surplus value, the idea that profit derived from the exploitation of labor, from the fact that workers produced more value than they were paid in wages, and that this surplus was appropriated by those who owned the means of production. It was not a matter of individual greed or immorality, but a structural feature of the system, built into the very logic of capital accumulation. The book analyzed the working day, the struggle between workers and capitalists over the length and intensity of labor. It examined machinery, showing how technological development under capitalism was driven by the search for profit rather than by human need. How machines that could lighten toil, instead intensified exploitation, as workers were forced to keep pace with the rhythms of industrial production. It explored accumulation, the drive to expand capital that was inherent in the system. The endless circuit of money, transformed into commodities, transformed back into more money, a process that knew no natural limit. That would continue as long as profit could be extracted. The prose was demanding, mixing high theory with passages of almost literary power, particularly in the descriptions of working class life, where Karl's outrage at the human cost of capitalism broke through the scientific analysis. He quoted extensively from factory reports, letting the evidence speak, the children working 16-hour days, the workers dying of industrial diseases, the families crowded into unsanitary housing. It was both a work of rigorous theory and a work of moral passion, though the morality was embedded in the analysis rather than preached from outside. The response was mixed. Some socialist intellectuals recognized it as a major achievement, a breakthrough in understanding. Workers' organizations began studying it, though its difficulty meant it was read more by leaders and educated workers than by the masses. The mainstream economists largely ignored it or dismissed it, unwilling to engage seriously with a critique that challenged the foundations of their discipline. Reviews were few, sales modest. Karl had hoped for more immediate impact, for recognition of what he had accomplished. But he was also used to working in relative obscurity, sustained by the conviction that truth would eventually assert itself, that future generations would recognize the importance of what he had written. He planned 2 more volumes, extending the analysis to cover the circulation of capital and the overall structure of the capitalist system. He worked on the manuscripts for these volumes through the remaining years of his life, generating thousands more pages of notes and drafts. But the perfectionism and the illness made it increasingly difficult to bring the work to completion. Ingalls would later edit and publish the 2nd and 3rd volumes from the manuscripts Karl left behind. But Karl himself would complete only the 1st volume, the rest remaining drafts and fragments, monuments to both his ambition and his struggle. The 1860s and 1870s saw Karl becoming more active in the international workers' movement. He was a central figure in the International Workingmen's Association, the first international, which brought together workers' organizations from different countries. He drafted addresses, participated in debates about strategy and tactics, fought against rival tendencies within the movement, particularly the anarchists led by Mikhail Bakunin, who rejected the idea of political struggle and state power that Karl believed was necessary for the transition to communism. The conflicts within the International were intense, sometimes bitter, reflecting genuine disagreements about the path forward, but also reflecting Karl's own difficulty in working with those who did not accept his theoretical authority. The International itself eventually collapsed, torn apart by internal conflicts and by the repression that followed the Paris Commune of 1871. The Commune, a revolutionary government that briefly controlled Paris before being brutally suppressed, had excited Karl's imagination and support. Here was the working class actually seizing power, attempting to reorganize society along democratic lines, showing in practice what a workers' government might look like. The defeat of the Commune and the massacre of thousands of its supporters was a blow, but Karl wrote a powerful defense of it. The Civil War in France, arguing that the Commune had shown the way forward, had demonstrated that the working class could govern, that a new form of political organization was possible. Jenny's health declined through the 1870s. She had endured so much: the poverty, the constant moving, the deaths of children. The strain of managing a household on nothing while Karl worked on texts that might or might not ever be finished, that might or might not make a difference. She developed liver cancer, suffering increasing pain. Karl tended to her, sitting by her bedside, reading to her, holding her hand. She died in December 1881, and Karl was shattered. The grief was profound, mixed perhaps with guilt, with the knowledge of what she had sacrificed, how much of the burden she had carried. He was too ill himself to follow the funeral procession to the cemetery, a failure that haunted him. His own death came 14 months later, in March 1883. He died in his armchair in the house in London, where the family had finally achieved some measure of stability. Ingel's and Karl's daughter Eleanor at his side. He was 64 years old, worn out by decades of work and illness and struggle. Ingel's, in the eulogy he delivered at the graveside in Highgate Cemetery, said that Karl Marx had been above all a revolutionist, that his real mission in life had been to contribute to the overthrow of capitalist society and to the emancipation of the working class. The grave was simple at first, attended mainly by family and a small circle of socialists who recognized what had been lost. The world at large barely noticed the passing of this exile, who had spent his life in libraries and meetings, writing dense books that few had read. The obituaries were few and brief. But Engels had predicted that Marx's name and work would endure through the centuries, and in this he was not wrong. The ideas that Karl had spent his life developing, refining, defending would spread across the world in the decades that followed, shaping revolutions, inspiring movements, becoming one of the defining intellectual and political forces of the 20th century, for better and worse, generating devotion and opposition in equal measure, but undeniably changing forever how human beings understood society, power, and the possibility of transformative change. The years between his return from Paris in 1849 and his death in 1883 were years of endurance more than triumph, years in which Karl worked in relative obscurity, while the world seemed to move in directions that contradicted his predictions. The revolutions had failed, capitalism was expanding and consolidating. The working class in England and elsewhere seemed more interested in incremental reforms than in revolutionary transformation. Yet Karl continued, sustained by a conviction that went deeper than immediate circumstances, a belief that he had grasped something fundamental about how history moved, about the laws that governed social development, and that this understanding would eventually prove its worth. The daily reality of those London years was far from the grandeur of world historical theory. It was bills unpaid and creditors knocking at the door. It was children's shoes worn through and no money to replace them. It was Jenny trying to maintain some dignity while negotiating with pawnbrokers and shopkeepers. It was Karl working in the British Museum reading room day after day, his handwriting growing shakier as illness progressed, his beard growing whiter, his body aging prematurely under the accumulated strain. He became a familiar figure to the staff at the museum, arriving when the doors opened, settling into his usual seat, surrounding himself with books and papers, working with fierce concentration until closing time. The reading room itself was a peculiar space, a great domed hall filled with scholars and eccentrics, with people pursuing every imaginable form of research. Karl sat among them, one researcher among many. But his purpose was different from most. He was not simply accumulating knowledge for its own sake or for professional advancement. He was excavating the secrets of a system, trying to expose its inner workings so thoroughly that those who lived under it would understand they did not have to accept it as inevitable or eternal. Every statistic about working hours, every detail about factory conditions, every analysis of profit rates and wage levels was ammunition for a struggle, evidence in a case he was building against the entire structure of capitalist society. His method was painstaking, exhaustive. He would read an economist like Adam Smith, not just to extract the main arguments, but to understand the assumptions, to trace how concepts were defined, to notice what was included and what was excluded. He read government reports, industrial journals, financial newspapers, building up a detailed picture of how the economy actually functioned beneath the level of abstract theory. He was looking for contradictions, for places where the system's own logic led to problems it could not solve, where the pursuit of profit came into conflict with human need, or even with the system's own stability. The theory of surplus value that emerged from this research was elegant in its simplicity, but profound in its implications. Workers, Karl argued, were paid roughly the value needed to reproduce their capacity to labor, to keep themselves alive and raise the next generation of workers. But in the course of a working day, they produced value beyond this, and this surplus was taken by the capitalist as profit. It was not theft in the legal sense. Everything happened through voluntary exchange in markets, but it was exploitation nonetheless, a structural arrangement in which one class appropriated the product of another's labor. And because competition forced capitalists to constantly seek more profit, to accumulate more capital, the pressure on workers was relentless, driving toward longer hours, lower wages, more intense labor, until workers organized collectively to resist. This was why capitalism produced both wealth and misery, why it could generate unprecedented productive capacity while leaving masses of people in poverty. The system worked not for human welfare, but for the accumulation of capital, and human needs were served only incidentally, only when they coincided with opportunities for profit. A factory would be built not because people needed the goods it produced, but because someone could make money producing them. Workers would be employed not because they needed work, but because their labor could be exploited profitably. The moment they ceased to be profitable, they would be discarded, left to starve or survive as best they could. It was a system, Karl wrote with bitter irony, in which everything solid melted into air, in which all fixed relations were swept away by the constant revolutionizing of production, in which people's lives were subject to forces they could not control or even fully understand. Yet Karl did not see workers as simply victims. This was crucial to his entire framework. Workers were also potentially the agents of change, the force that could transform society, because they were both the source of all value, and the class that had no stake in preserving the existing system. They owned no property, no means of production, only their capacity to labor. They could not become capitalists themselves, except in rare individual cases that proved nothing about the system as a whole. Their only path to a better life was collective, through organization, through struggle, through eventually taking control of the means of production and running society for the benefit of all, rather than for the profit of a few. This was not utopian dreaming, Karl insisted, but scientific analysis. He distinguished himself sharply from earlier socialists who had imagined ideal communities or appealed to abstract principles of justice. He claimed to be discovering the actual laws of historical development, showing how capitalism created the conditions for its own transcendence, how the working class was formed by the system itself into a force capable of overthrowing it. Whether this claim to scientific status was justified, whether history really operated according to discoverable laws in the way natural phenomena did, would be debated endlessly. But for Karl, the claim was essential. It meant his conclusions were not merely wishes but discoveries, not opinions but truths that would be validated by the unfolding of history itself. His relationship with his children during these years was complicated by his work and by the poverty that overshadowed family life. He loved them. This was clear, and they him. He would play with them when they were small, tell stories, make up elaborate games. As they grew older, he shared his ideas with them, treating them as intellectual companions capable of understanding serious matters. His daughters, particularly Jenny and Eleanor, developed into educated, capable women with their own political commitments, carrying forward in different ways the legacy of their father's work. But the poverty marked them all, the childhood illnesses, the constant anxiety, the awareness of being different from other families, of living under a shadow of economic insecurity and political suspicion. 3 children had died in the early London years, small bodies buried in a cemetery far from any ancestral home. The grief of these losses never entirely faded. Jenny, Karl's wife, carried it most heavily, a weight that added to all her other burdens. She had been beautiful once, cultured, sought after, the daughter of a prominent family. She had chosen Karl knowing it would mean a difficult life, but perhaps she had not imagined quite how difficult, how sustained and grinding the poverty would be, how many times she would face humiliation, how often she would have to choose between necessities, because there was no possibility of having both. She endured without much complaint, at least in any written record that survived. But the toll was visible in her declining health, in the illnesses that increasingly confined her. Karl's writing during these decades was not limited to his economic analysis. He wrote about current events, about wars and political developments, offering commentary that applied his analytical framework to immediate situations. He wrote about the American Civil War, seeing in it a struggle that, whatever the intentions of the participants, was objectively about whether capitalism would develop along a path that included slavery or would be forced to rely on free wage labor. He supported the North, seeing the destruction of slavery as a progressive necessity, even while recognizing that wage labor under capitalism was itself a form of exploitation, different from slavery, but sharing with it the fundamental feature that the laborer did not control the product of his own work. He wrote about India, about how British colonialism had destroyed traditional society, bringing misery and exploitation, but also, he argued, creating the preconditions for eventual modernization and liberation. The passages about colonialism in his work are among the most troubling from a contemporary perspective, reflecting assumptions about progress and development that seem to justify immense suffering in the name of historical necessity. Karl saw colonialism as brutal but historically progressive, breaking up stagnant societies and incorporating them into a global system that would eventually produce the conditions for worldwide revolution. Whether this judgment can be defended or whether it reveals limitations and blind spots in his thinking remains a matter of fierce debate. He continued to be involved in organizational work when energy and health permitted. He corresponded with socialists across Europe, offering advice, adjudicating disputes, trying to shape the emerging workers' movement according to his understanding of what was necessary. He could be generous and patient in these exchanges, but he could also be harsh and dismissive, particularly toward those who questioned his theoretical authority or pursued what he considered mistaken strategies. The archives contain letters of devastating sarcasm directed at rivals and critics, letters that display Karl's polemical brilliance, but also a certain intellectual cruelty, an inability to accept that intelligent and committed people might legitimately disagree with him. The conflict with Bakunin and the anarchists within the International was particularly bitter. Bakunin rejected the idea of a transitional workers' state, arguing that any state would inevitably become oppressive, that the goal should be the immediate abolition of all political authority. Karl thought this was naive, that the bourgeoisie would not simply surrender power because workers declared they wanted no state. That organized force would be necessary to suppress counter-revolution and to begin the work of reorganizing society. The debate touched on fundamental questions about the relationship between means and ends, about whether you could use state power to achieve liberation, or whether the use of such power would inevitably corrupt the project. History would show that these were not merely theoretical questions, that the choices made would have profound consequences for millions of lives. Engels remained Karl's closest friend and collaborator throughout these years, the one person besides Jenny who fully understood what Karl was trying to do and who could engage with the work at the highest level. Their correspondence is extraordinary, ranging across politics, economics, science, literature, gossip, personal matters, everything that concerned them. Engels was often the first reader of Karl's drafts, offering comments and suggestions, encouraging him to finish and publish. Engels also played a crucial practical role, managing Karl's relationships with publishers, helping to place articles, and above all providing the financial support that made the work possible. Without Engels, it is hard to see how Karl could have completed even what he did. The financial dependence was not without its tensions and complications. Karl was sometimes resentful of needing help, sometimes demanding in his requests, sometimes slow to acknowledge what he owed. Engels bore this with remarkable patience, seeing it as a small price for the privilege of contributing to work he considered historically important. He subordinated his own theoretical work, which was considerable, to the practical task of supporting Karl, spending years in Manchester in business that he found tedious, but that provided the income he needed to send regular payments to London. It was one of the great friendships in intellectual history, but it was also unequal, and the inequality had costs that are perhaps not fully visible in the affectionate exchanges of their letters. Karl traveled occasionally when he could afford it, and when health permitted, seeking better climates that might ease his symptoms, visiting Engels in Manchester, attending meetings and congresses when the workers' movement required it. These journeys were breaks from the routine of London, brief respites from the grinding poverty and the isolation of research, but they were also exhausting, difficult for a man in poor health and uncertain finances. He went to Carlsbad in Bohemia for the waters, to Ramsgate on the English coast for sea air, to Algeria briefly in a vain search for warmth that might help his lungs. These trips seldom delivered the health improvements he hoped for, and they left him anxious about the expense, about the work left undone, about Jenny managing alone in London. His reputation grew slowly in socialist circles. By the 1870s, he was recognized as a major theorist, his name known to educated workers and radical intellectuals across Europe. The publication of Capital had established him as a serious economic thinker, not just a political agitator. Workers' organizations began translating his writings into various languages, making them available to broader audiences. Study groups formed to work through the difficult text of Capital, trying to extract from it tools for understanding their own situation and strategies for struggle. Karl received letters from workers asking questions, sharing experiences, telling him how his ideas had helped them make sense of their lives. These letters moved him, confirming his belief that he was writing not for academic recognition, but for a movement, for people engaged in the actual work of transforming society. Yet there was also frustration that the work progressed so slowly that the later volumes of Capital remained unfinished. His perfectionism was partly to blame, the sense that he needed to read more, to verify every detail, to anticipate every objection. But the illness was also a major factor, the days lost to pain and fatigue. The inability to concentrate, the simple physical difficulty of sitting and writing for extended periods. He worked when he could, producing more manuscript pages, but the work seemed never to reach a point where he felt ready to release it. Ingalls urged him repeatedly to publish what he had, arguing that something was better than nothing, that the movement needed the analysis, even if it was incomplete. But Karl could not bring himself to do it. The Paris Commune in 1871 was a dramatic interruption in the slow routine of research and writing. When workers seized control of Paris and established a revolutionary government, Karl watched with intense interest, corresponding with participants, trying to understand what was happening, what it meant. The Commune lasted only 2 months before being crushed by French troops with extraordinary brutality, thousands executed, thousands more imprisoned or exiled. Karl wrote The Civil War in France as a defense of the Commune and an analysis of its significance, arguing that it had shown the form a workers' state might take, based on democratic councils, with officials elected and recallable, with power genuinely exercised from below rather than concentrated in a bureaucratic apparatus above society. The text was powerful, one of Karl's most accessible and politically engaged works. It was widely read and discussed, cementing his reputation, but also making him more of a target for conservative governments who saw in his writings a direct threat to public order. The Commune had terrified the ruling classes of Europe, showing that workers could actually take power. That revolution was not just rhetoric, but a real possibility. The repression that followed was savage precisely because the threat had been real, and anyone associated with defending the Commune was viewed with suspicion and hostility. Jenny's illness in the late 1870s brought new sorrow to a household that had already endured so much. She had been the anchor of the family, managing impossible situations, holding things together when they threatened to fall apart. Now she was dying slowly and painfully, and there was nothing Karl could do except sit with her, try to ease her suffering, confront the approaching loss of the person who had shared his life through all its difficulties. She died in December 1881, and Karl was devastated. He had leaned on her more than he perhaps fully recognized, had taken for granted her strength and her willingness to endure. Now she was gone, and he was left with grief and perhaps with guilt, with questions about what he had asked of her, what she had sacrificed. He survived her by only 14 months, his own health collapsing after her death. It was as if he had been held together partly by the need to care for her, and with her gone, his body gave up its long fight against illness and exhaustion. He died quietly in his armchair, sleeping away on a March afternoon while his daughter Eleanor was in the next room. Angels, coming to visit, found him gone. The sharp mind finally stilled, the restless energy dissipated into silence. The funeral at Highgate Cemetery was attended by a small group, family and close comrades from the socialist movement. Engels delivered the eulogy, speaking in the cold wind, asserting that Karl Marx had discovered the law of development of human history, that his name would endure through the ages. It was a bold claim made over the grave of a man who had died in relative obscurity, whose major work was incomplete, whose influence was limited to a small radical movement on the margins of European politics. But Engels believed it, and time would show he was not entirely wrong, though perhaps not in ways either he or Karl would have anticipated or approved. The legacy began to unfold slowly in the years after Karl's death. Engels edited and published the second and third volumes of Capital from the manuscripts Karl left, massive works that extended the analysis to cover the circulation of capital and the structure of the capitalist system as a whole. Socialist parties across Europe adopted Marxism as their theoretical framework, claiming to be implementing Karl's scientific socialism. The German Social Democratic Party, the largest and most successful of these organizations, built a powerful movement that combined revolutionary rhetoric with practical parliamentary work, organizing workers, winning reforms, preparing for the day when capitalism would collapse and socialism could be instituted. But the relationship between Karl's ideas and the movements that claimed his legacy was complicated from the beginning. What did it mean to apply his analysis, which was rooted in close study of mid-19th century British capitalism, to different countries at different stages of development? Could his categories be translated directly to Russia, which had barely begun to industrialize, or to agrarian societies in Asia or Latin America? Were his predictions about the inevitable collapse of capitalism meant to be taken literally? Or were they conditional statements about tendencies that might be counteracted by other factors? The texts themselves did not always provide clear answers, and different readers found different emphases, different possibilities of interpretation. Karl had written that he was not a Marxist, reportedly making this comment in response to some French socialists who were, in his view, vulgarizing and distorting his ideas. It was a revealing statement, suggesting his awareness that his work was already being transformed in the process of reception, turned into something simpler and more dogmatic than he had intended. He had tried to develop a method of analysis, a way of approaching social reality that was historical, materialist, and dialectical, attentive to complexity and contradiction. But movements needed certainties, needed clear guidelines for action, and so the method was often reduced to a set of formulas, the analysis to a collection of slogans. The 20th century would see the triumph and tragedy of Marxism on a scale Karl could not have imagined. Revolutions made in his name would reshape vast territories, affecting the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, dozens of smaller revolutionary movements and governments, all would claim Karl Marx as their inspiration, their theoretical guide. Political parties around the world would organize under the banner of Marxism, Leninism, or one of its variants, building mass movements, winning elections in some places, seizing power through armed struggle in others. But the record would be deeply mixed, profoundly troubling. The socialist societies that emerged in the 20th century would achieve some real gains: literacy, healthcare, industrialization, the elimination of certain forms of poverty and exploitation. But they would also produce new forms of oppression: bureaucratic dictatorships, surveillance states, systems that claimed to represent workers, but that denied workers any real say in decisions affecting their lives. Millions would die in famines, purges, and wars conducted by governments that claimed to be building socialism. The gap between the emancipatory vision in Karl's writings and the reality of actually existing socialism would become so wide that many would question whether there was any meaningful connection at all. This was not what Karl had intended or predicted. He had imagined socialism emerging in the most advanced capitalist countries, where industrialization had created a large working class and where the productive forces were highly developed. He had thought revolution would be democratic, based on the self-organization of workers, leading to a society with greater freedom and equality. The revolutions that actually occurred in his name happened mostly in relatively backward countries, led by disciplined parties that substituted themselves for the working class, building systems that concentrated enormous power in the hands of state bureaucracies. Whether this betrayed Karl's vision or revealed something problematic in it remains one of the great debates of political theory and history. In the capitalist West, Marxism became an important current in intellectual life, influencing sociology, economics, history, literary criticism, philosophy. Scholars studied Karl's texts carefully, debating their meaning, developing different schools of interpretation. Western Marxism, as it came to be called, was often more philosophical than political, more concerned with questions of culture and consciousness than with revolutionary strategy. Thinkers like George Lucas C.S., Antonio Gramsci, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and many others developed sophisticated readings of Karl's work, applying it to new questions, integrating it with other theoretical traditions, keeping it alive as a critical perspective on capitalism, even in periods when revolutionary prospects seemed dim. The collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite states in 1989-1991 seemed to many to mark the final defeat of Marxism. The vindication of capitalism, the end of history, as one triumphant liberal thinker proclaimed. The revolutions in Eastern Europe were revolutions against communism, against systems that had claimed to embody Karl's vision. Workers in these countries wanted not more socialism, but less, wanted integration into the capitalist world economy, wanted the consumer goods and personal freedoms they associated with the West. For a time, it seemed Karl Marx would be consigned to history, a 19th century figure whose ideas had inspired a failed experiment, now to be studied as a cautionary tale. But capitalism did not stop producing the contradictions and crises Karl had analyzed. The gap between rich and poor continued to widen. Financial crises erupted periodically, destroying jobs and savings, revealing the fragility beneath apparent prosperity. Environmental destruction accelerated, raising questions about the sustainability of a system based on endless growth. New forms of precarious labor emerged, workers without security or benefits, their lives shaped by forces as impersonal and uncontrollable as anything Karl had described in Capital. And so people kept returning to his work, finding in it tools for understanding a world that still seemed to operate according to the logic of capital accumulation rather than human need. Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery became a site of pilgrimage, visited by students and activists, by curious tourists and devoted followers. A large monument was erected over it, with Karl's bronze head gazing out sternly, and beneath it the famous phrase from the Theses on Feuerbach: "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." It captured something essential about his project, the insistence that thought must lead to action, that understanding the world is inseparable from the commitment to transform it. Whether that transformation would take the form he envisioned, whether his analysis provided an adequate guide, remained open questions, but the impulse he articulated, the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable, continued to resonate. His personal life, looked at across the span of years, appeared as a kind of extended struggle against adversity, a determination to complete work he believed mattered despite poverty, illness, exile, and loss. He had not been an easy person, not a saint or a simple hero. He had been difficult, sometimes arrogant, demanding of those around him, capable of cruelty in his polemics. He had let his family suffer while pursuing his intellectual work, had depended on the labor and generosity of others, had not always acknowledged what he owed. But he had also been capable of love, of friendship, of tenderness with his children, of loyalty to causes and comrades. He had worked with ferocious dedication, pushing himself beyond what his health could sustain, driven by conviction that what he was doing mattered, that it served something larger than personal ambition. The question of what Karl Marx really means, what his legacy actually is, remains contested and probably always will be. To some, he is the prophet of revolution, the theorist who revealed the contradictions of capitalism and pointed toward a different possible future. To others, he is the intellectual godfather of totalitarianism, responsible through his ideas for the crimes of communist regimes. To still others, he is simply an important thinker whose work contains insights worth preserving alongside errors worth criticizing, part of an ongoing conversation about how societies function and how they might be organized more justly. What seems clear is that Karl Marx changed how human beings think about society, economy, power, and history. After him, it became impossible to analyze social phenomena without considering material conditions, without asking who benefits from particular arrangements, without recognizing that ideas and institutions are not natural or eternal, but are products of specific historical circumstances and can therefore be changed. He made class central to social analysis, showing how societies were structured around conflicts of interest between groups with different relationships to the means of production. He demonstrated that capitalism, despite its claims to be based on freedom and equality, contained systematic exploitation and generated regular crises. Whether his specific predictions were accurate, whether his solutions were workable, his questions and his method of asking them transformed social thought. In the quiet of the reading room at the British Museum, day after day for decades, Karl Marx had sat among the books and papers, building an analysis of how the modern world worked. He had done it without institutional support, without academic position, without financial security, sustained by friendship and family, and by belief in the importance of the task. The books he produced were difficult, demanding, incomplete, but they contained a vision of society as something created by human beings through their labor and their struggles, and therefore as something human beings could recreate differently if they understood it well enough and organized themselves effectively enough. Whether that vision was fundamentally correct, whether the path he pointed toward can lead to a better world or only to new forms of oppression and suffering, history has not yet rendered a final verdict. What he offered was a way of seeing, a framework for understanding the forces that shape lives, for recognizing that what appears natural and eternal is actually historical and changeable. The work remains dense and difficult, embedded in its time, but asking questions that persist, demanding to be engaged with, disagreed with, built upon, or rejected, but not easily ignored by anyone seriously concerned with understanding and addressing the structures of power and inequality that continue to mark human societies. And so Karl Marx rests in Highgate Cemetery, his grave visited and tended, his books still read, his name still invoked in debates about how we live and how we might live differently. A thinker whose ideas emerged from specific 19th century circumstances, but whose influence extended far beyond them, shaping the 20th century and continuing to echo into the 21st. A presence that cannot be easily dismissed or simply celebrated, but that remains, for better and worse, part of how we think about ourselves and our shared world. The decades that followed Karl's death saw his ideas travel in directions he could not have anticipated, moving through translation and interpretation, adapting to contexts far removed from the London reading room where they had been forged. In Russia, a young revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin read Capital while imprisoned in Siberia, finding in it a framework for understanding his own country's development and a justification for revolutionary action even in a society that had barely begun to industrialize. Lenin would adapt Karl's ideas, arguing that revolution could begin in backward countries if led by a disciplined vanguard party, that the process did not have to wait for capitalism to fully mature. This was a significant departure from what Karl himself had suggested, but it was made in his name, claiming his authority. The transformation of Karl's work into an official state ideology in the Soviet Union after 1917 would have consequences he could not have imagined. His writings became sacred texts, studied in schools, cited in party documents, used to justify policies that ranged from industrial development to political repression. The complexity and openness of his analysis hardened into dogma, into a set of fixed positions that could not be questioned without risking accusations of heresy. Marxism, Leninism, as it came to be called, was something different from what Karl had written, more rigid, more certain, more willing to sacrifice present human welfare for future historical goals. Whether Karl would have recognized or approved of what was done in his name is unknowable. Though his own writings about the importance of human freedom and the dangers of state power suggest, he might have been troubled. In China, another revolutionary, Mao Zedong, would take Karl's ideas and adapt them further, arguing that revolution could be based on the peasantry rather than the industrial working class, that agrarian societies could skip stages and move directly toward socialism. This too was a significant revision, but it was presented as a development of Marxism, an application to Chinese conditions. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 brought Karl's name and image to hundreds of millions of people who knew nothing of 19th century Europe, who lived in villages where the problems Karl had analyzed seemed remote, but who were told that his theories explained their situation and pointed toward liberation. The spread of Marxism through the post-colonial world in the mid-20th century represented another unexpected turn. Anti-colonial movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America found in Karl's analysis tools for understanding imperialism, for explaining how their societies had been subordinated to European economic interests. His critique of capitalism could be extended to a critique of colonialism and neocolonialism, showing how wealth was extracted from peripheral regions to enrich the core. Revolutionary movements from Vietnam to Cuba to Angola claimed Marxist inspiration, sometimes combining it with nationalism, sometimes with indigenous traditions, creating hybrid ideologies that bore Karl's name, but that reflected local circumstances and struggles. Yet each of these applications raised questions about the universality of Karl's analysis. He had studied capitalism in its most advanced form, in Britain where industrialization was most developed. Could his categories simply be transferred to societies with different histories, different social structures, different relationships between state and economy? The debates within Marxism about these questions were intense and ongoing, with different factions claiming to represent the true inheritance of Karl's work, while accusing others of betrayal or distortion. The unity of Marxism as a single coherent tradition fractured into competing schools, each with its own interpretation, its own practical program. In the West, where capitalism continued to develop and where working class movements won significant reforms, without revolution, Karl's predictions about immiserization and inevitable collapse seemed not to be materializing. Workers' living standards rose, unions won better wages and conditions, welfare states provided social protections that cushioned the harshest effects of market forces. Social democratic parties that claimed Marxist heritage became reformist rather than revolutionary, working within capitalist systems to achieve improvements rather than seeking to overthrow them. This too raised questions about Karl's analysis. Had he been wrong about capitalism's trajectory? Or were these reforms temporary? Achievements that would be rolled back in later crises, merely postponing rather than preventing the contradictions he had identified. The question of gender, barely addressed in Karl's own writings, became increasingly important as feminist movements grew in strength. His analysis focused on class, on the relationship between capital and labor, treating the family and the domestic sphere as secondary, derivative of economic structures. But feminists pointed out that women's unpaid labor in the home was essential to capitalism. That gender oppression could not be reduced to class exploitation, that any comprehensive analysis of society had to examine how patriarchy and capitalism intersected and reinforced each other. Some feminists drew on Karl's method to develop analyses of women's oppression, while others argued that his framework was inadequate, too limited by the assumptions of his time. Similarly, questions of race and colonialism, which Karl had addressed only partially and sometimes problematically, demanded more thorough engagement. His comments about non-European societies often reflected the prejudices of his era, assumptions about progress and civilization that justified European dominance. Later Marxists, particularly those from colonized societies, had to critically examine and reconstruct the framework, developing analyses of racial capitalism, of how racial hierarchies were not just ideological, but were fundamental to how capitalism functioned globally. This work both extended and challenged Karl's legacy. Taking seriously his commitment to understanding exploitation while recognizing that his own analysis had blind spots shaped by his position as a European man in the 19th century. The environmental crisis that became increasingly apparent in the late 20th and early 21st centuries posed another challenge to Karl's framework. His analysis had assumed continuing growth in productive forces, had seen the development of technology and industry as progressive, even while criticizing how capitalism organized that development. But as ecological limits became clearer, as climate change threatened catastrophe, questions arose about whether Karl's framework could accommodate an understanding of natural limits, whether his vision of socialism had itself been too focused on growth and production. Some eco-socialists argued that Karl's materialism provided tools for understanding environmental destruction under capitalism, while others suggested that his basic orientation needed to be fundamentally rethought in light of ecological realities. The personal details of Karl's life, long overshadowed by the political and intellectual legacy, became subjects of increased attention and controversy. His relationship with his family, particularly the burdens placed on Jenny, invited scrutiny and criticism. The revelation that he had fathered a child with the family's housekeeper, Helene de Muth, a son named Frederick, who was acknowledged by Engels but not by Karl, complicated the image of the devoted family man. It suggested hypocrisy, a willingness to demand sacrifices from others while exempting himself, though the full truth of that relationship and Karl's knowledge and choices regarding it remain unclear. These personal failings, real or alleged, did not invalidate his intellectual work, but they reminded observers that he was a flawed human being, not a secular saint, and that there could be gaps between the values someone articulated and the way they actually lived. The monuments to Karl that appeared in various places during the 20th century testified to his status as a world historical figure, but they also revealed the tensions around his legacy. In communist countries, massive statues depicted him in heroic style, often alongside Lenin, embodying the official ideology of the state. In Western countries, his image appeared in academic contexts, on book covers, sometimes in ironic or critical artistic works. After the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, many of these monuments were removed, toppled, or relocated, as societies tried to reckon with a past in which Karl's ideas had been used to justify systems many had experienced as oppressive. Yet even in removal, the monuments testified to his significance, to the fact that his work had shaped the 20th century in profound ways, for better and worse. The scholarly industry that grew around Karl's writings became vast and complex. Complete editions of his works and correspondence were published, making available texts that had remained in archives, early drafts and fragments that showed the development of his thinking. Conferences devoted to interpreting his work were held regularly. Journals published debates about what he really meant, what remained valuable in his analysis, what needed to be abandoned or revised. This academic Marxism sometimes seemed far removed from the revolutionary purpose that had animated Karl's own work, but it also preserved his ideas as living questions rather than dead dogma, keeping them available for new generations to engage with critically. In the 21st century, after the triumphalism of capitalism's supposed final victory had faded in the wake of financial crises, rising inequality, and growing ecological disaster, interest in Karl's work experienced something of a revival. Young people facing precarious employment, crushing debt, and dim prospects for the future found in his analysis an explanation for why the system seemed rigged against them. The language of class struggle, of exploitation, of capitalism's inherent instability, resonated in ways it had not during the optimistic decades that followed the Cold War's end. New editions of Capital appeared, reading groups formed, and Karl's ideas circulated again in activist circles, adapted to contemporary circumstances but recognizable as variations on themes he had explored more than a century earlier. The question of what could or should replace capitalism, the question Karl had been less explicit about than the analysis of what was wrong with capitalism, remained vexed and urgent. He had written relatively little about what a communist society would actually look like, insisting that it was not his task to write recipes for the cookshops of the future, that the form of a new society would emerge from the struggles that created it. This reticence had seemed principled, an avoidance of utopianism, but it also meant that movements claiming his legacy lacked clear guidance, could fill in the blank space of the communist future with their own visions, which sometimes turned authoritarian and oppressive. Contemporary thinkers struggling with questions of how to organize an economy democratically, how to plan production without markets while avoiding bureaucratic centralization, how to balance individual freedom with collective needs, often found that Karl's work raised the right questions, but did not provide complete answers. His critique of capitalism remained powerful, his method of analysis valuable, but the constructive project, the work of actually building an alternative, required imagination and experimentation that went beyond what he had written. This was perhaps as it should be, each generation having to solve its own problems, rather than simply applying formulas from the past. But it meant that Karl's legacy remained unfinished, a work in progress rather than a completed system. The grave in Highgate Cemetery stood as a physical reminder of the man behind the ideas, the person who had lived and struggled and died in a particular time and place. Visitors who came there found a monument to Karl Marx, the thinker. But beneath it lay the remains of Karl Marx, the human being, the father who had buried children, the husband who had watched his wife die slowly and painfully, the exile who had never found a home, the scholar who had worked in poverty and obscurity, driven by conviction that what he was doing mattered. The gap between the monument and the man, between the world, historical significance, and the lived experience of difficulty and loss, was itself a kind of lesson about how history works, how ideas emerge from specific lives and circumstances, yet take on meanings that transcend their origins. The controversies that continued to swirl around Karl's name and work, the competing claims about what he really meant, and whether his vision could or should be realized, were themselves testament to the power of what he had attempted. He had not provided easy answers or simple solutions, had not created a system that could be mechanically applied to any situation. What he had done was to insist that society could be understood, that the forces that shaped lives were not mysterious or natural, but were historical creations that could be analyzed and potentially changed. He had shown that economic structures were not neutral or technical, but were relations of power that served some interests at the expense of others. He had argued that human beings were not isolated individuals competing in markets, but social creatures whose possibilities and limitations were shaped by the collective organization of production and distribution. These insights, however one evaluated the specific theories he built on them, or the political movements that claimed his legacy, had permanently altered how societies thought about themselves. After Karl Marx, it became impossible for serious social thought to ignore questions of class, of economic power, of how material conditions shaped consciousness and possibility. His work established a tradition of critical analysis that examined society not as it claimed to be, but as it actually functioned, that looked beneath ideological justifications to understand interests and power relations. Whether one agreed with his conclusions or not, the questions he asked and the methods he developed for approaching them remained important, remained part of the intellectual tools available for understanding a world still marked by exploitation, inequality, and avoidable suffering. In the end, perhaps what mattered most about Karl Marx was not whether his specific predictions proved accurate, or whether the societies built in his name achieved what they promised, but rather that he insisted on the possibility of human agency in history, on the capacity of people to understand their circumstances and to act collectively to change them. He rejected both the idea that the existing order was natural and eternal, and the idea that history unfolded according to some predetermined plan. Instead, he saw history as made by human beings through their struggles, shaped by material conditions but not rigidly determined by them, open to transformation through conscious action based on understanding. This was the kernel of hope in his work, the reason it continued to inspire people who faced injustice and wanted to believe that another world was possible. It was not a guarantee, not a promise that revolution would inevitably succeed, or that socialism would automatically solve all problems. It was rather an affirmation that the future was not fixed, that the structures that caused suffering were not unchangeable laws of nature, but were human creations that could be unmade and replaced with something better, if people understood them clearly enough and organized themselves effectively enough to do so. Karl Marx died in relative obscurity, an exile who had spent his life in poverty, working on books that few read, supporting movements that had not succeeded in their revolutionary aims. Yet his ideas spread across the world, shaping revolutions and inspiring movements, becoming one of the dominant intellectual and political forces of the 20th century. Whether that influence was ultimately beneficial or harmful remains contested, but what is undeniable is that his work mattered, that it changed how human beings understood society and their place in it, that it opened possibilities of thought and action that had not existed before. The life had been hard, marked by loss and struggle, by choices that had costs for himself and for those who loved him. The work had been immense, undertaken with ferocious determination despite obstacles that would have stopped most people. The legacy was complicated, claimed by movements and governments that did things he might not have approved, inspiring both liberation struggles and authoritarian regimes, remaining valuable to some and deeply problematic to others. But across all the controversy and complication, Karl Marx's insistence that the world could be understood and changed, that human beings did not have to simply accept the conditions they were born into, but could act collectively to create something better, endured as a challenge and an invitation to each new generation that encountered his work. In the quiet of the cemetery, the monument stood over the grave, bronze head weathering slowly, inscription still legible, a place where people came to remember, to argue, to reflect on what his life and work had meant and might still mean. The man was long gone, returned to the earth. But the questions he had asked, the methods he had developed, the vision of human possibility he had articulated, remained alive in the world, transformed and contested, but still present, still demanding engagement, still refusing to let anyone simply accept that the way things are is the way they must be. And perhaps that is legacy enough for any life, to have asked questions that outlive you, to have opened paths of thought and action that others continue to walk, argue about, branch away from, and return to. Karl Marx had lived fully, had thought deeply, had loved and been loved, had suffered and caused suffering, had worked with dedication at a task he believed mattered. He had tried to understand the world so that it could be changed, had given his life to that effort, and whether he succeeded or failed, whether his specific vision was correct or flawed, the effort itself stood as testimony to human capacity for intellectual courage, for commitment to something larger than personal comfort, for the refusal to simply accept injustice as inevitable. The story ends in silence, as all stories must, with a life concluded, a work left for others to judge and use as they will, a name that would echo through history in ways the man who bore it could not have fully anticipated or controlled. Karl Marx was gone, but the questions he had lived with, the struggles he had tried to illuminate, the possibility of transformation he had insisted on, remained in the world, waiting for each new generation to engage with them, to learn from them, to carry them forward, or to set them aside, but in any case to reckon with the fact that he had been there, had done the work, had changed forever how human beings could think about their collective life and its possibilities.